Ever wonder why you constantly feel left out, excluded, not well liked, or loved? Is this true or a perception? Well, there is a reason. I've got back today with me is Dr. Dodson, who's a board certified adult psychiatrist, who was one of the first practitioners to specialize in adults with ADHD 25 years ago. He was named a Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association in 2012 for his work with adult ADHD. He's also got a book coming out at the end of summer of 2024 called Treating ADHD, one of its first kind of book out there on how to treat ADHD, adult ADHD primarily. Dr. Dodson, thanks again for joining us again.
Pleasure to be here.
So the last time you were here, we talked about the ADHD interest-based nervous system. So what I described there was that was one of the times where I heard the concept you described it at the pullover off the 401, which is interstate, and you guys know as interstate, to process, because that hit me like a ton of bricks as valid and made everything my whole life make sense. Then I listened a few months later, another podcast you had with the Attitude Magazine webinar series. Now you talk about RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. That was another clobber to the head that I had to pull over to the side of the road, and it made immediate sense to me. And this is what I want to discuss today. So am I correct in assuming or stating that you are one of the first ones to come up with this topic and discussion of RSD?
Well, I'd love to take that credit, but it really belongs to Dr. Paul Winder, who was the guy who originally described the ADHD syndrome. He and Dr. Fred Reimer.
Okay.
So oddly enough, they never used the technical term rejection sensitivity dysphoria, but they described it, put it together, and even started treating it. I was one that recognized that this is an old concept from back in my residency 45 years ago. And most doctors understand it as the hallmark of what we call atypical depression.
Atypical
the reason
depression?
it's not atypical depression. So if you really want to look it up, it's under atypical depression.
Okay.
Or reactive depression. By definition, mood disorders have to have a life of their own. People get sad for no particular reason. For people with atypical depression, in other words, what they didn't recognize as people with ADHD, their depression is reactive to something that just happened to them.
Right. Triggered. It was triggered somehow.
It's a triggered depression. Also, it's instantaneous. The trigger happens and boom, you go
instantaneous. Yep.
From 0 to suicidally depressed in the twinkling of an eye. And it also doesn't last the 2 weeks that are necessary in the diagnosis of a mood disorder. It has to have a duration unbroken of at least 2 weeks. For most people with ADHD, they're over that particular episode by the next morning.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why when they recognized what they were prepared to recognize, which was a mood disorder, because back then ADHD didn't happen in adults; it only happened in white elementary school age boys.
Right. So let's get a little bit clinically here. So what is rejection sensitivity dysphoria for the listeners?
Cool. I've always thought that it's very important to know what questions to ask. So the question I ask every patient is, look back over your entire life. Have you always been much more sensitive than anybody else you know to rejection, teasing, criticism, or your own perception that you have failed or fallen short?
Mm-hmm.
That's the definition right out of a textbook of rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And people with ADHD, virtually all of them, will go, yes, that's me.
Oh, yeah.
And again, we have to qualify some of this. Nobody likes being criticized. Nobody likes being rejected. Nobody likes failing or being seen as a failure. What we're talking about here is intensity.
What, sorry?
Intensity.
Intensity. The intensity.
Yeah,
Okay.
The word dysphoria is literally Greek for unbearable. This is more than just, being disappointed or being rejected or breaking up with your girlfriend or something like that. It is an unbearable emotional experience. People with ADHD just off the shelf uh, lead passionate, intense lives.
Mhm.
If you don't care about something, it's just not there. So what's left behind is people with ADHD are constantly dealing with things about which they feel intensely passionate.
Yes.
Uh, their highs are high, their lows are low. But in
All
addition
in
to,
or all out. Yeah.
yeah, but in addition to that, virtually everybody with ADHD also has this rejection sensitivity in which the perception, it doesn't have to be the reality, just the perception that somebody has slighted you, rejected you, or that you've done it to yourself because you didn't meet your own standards.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay. So a long time ago, you hit me with perception, perceived rejection, perceived slights. That hit me
Yes.
hard. But now you just said something else here now. What was that last part?
You can do it to yourself. And that's what the um, failed
Geez,
or
that's
fallen
huge.
short is.
That's
Yes.
huge.
When a person with ADHD doesn't meet their own, usually very high standard, almost unattainable standards, and they see themselves as having fallen short or failed, they can have this same rejection sensitivity. They reject themselves. Uh, how many times have people with ADHD had that negative voice going in their head about how could you, mess that up? You're such a fuck up.
Mm.
Um,
Wow,
and
man.
again, nobody else sees it or hears it. It's going on in their head, and it's that negative self-talk that can be devastating.
I
Um,
guarantee the listeners are going, holy crap, man. That makes a lot of sense. I never thought of it that way internally.
yeah. So, it's this is more than just being criticized or rejected or falling short. For people with ADHD, it is a devastating, catastrophic experience that is so severe that there's also a physical pain that goes with it.
Yes.
Most people with ADHD says it just, when it hits me, it just knocks me down, and it's like somebody just stabbed me in the chest, punched me. It's so severe, it's physically painful as well. The person can't function anymore. They very quickly try and get themselves out of whatever social situation they're in, so they can go someplace and hide until this goes over. Also, for most people, when they're in the middle of one of these episodes, they're not sure that it's ever going to end. They're afraid it's going to be like this forever, even if they've
That
had
one, that's
thousands
so
of these
true.
episodes.
That's so true. I don't, it feels like it's going to last for 100 years or a long
Right,
time. And I got to get the hell out of Dodge as quickly as possible.
right. Um, and that happens even though a person's had thousands of these rejection episodes. Um, each one is felt as if it's totally new and as if it's never going to end. There's
Mm.
a certain desperation that comes with that. Luckily, they do end. Personally, I haven't found anything that helps it end quicker. It seems to just have to run its course.
An
Um,
awareness of that occurring would also help with talking yourself down or out, or
exactly.
just
So just
knowing
this,
I don't have to
yeah,
react. Yeah.
just that cognitive notion of being able to remind yourself this does end. In fact, it'll probably end in a couple of hours at most. But it's going to be a real unpleasant ride until then. So
Yeah.
it, you get a couple of different ways of people trying to deal with it. Some people try to be perfect. The overachiever, the person who can do everything, the golden girl, uh, who's first in the class, does everything right, um, because they're trying to be above reproach. They try
Yeah.
to be the envy of everybody else. Um, the
Well,
problem
yeah. So
is
we can
that
prove our worth to everyone.
that's
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
and also to not have anything that could be rejected or criticized.
Right.
The problem with that is that it never ends. Today's audience does not applaud yesterday's performance. And so a person is constantly trying to protect themselves and their self-image.
And-
Now you can get another group of people who become people pleasers.
Mhm.
They can tell you when a stranger walks into the room within seconds of exactly what that person likes, praises, approves of, and that's what they give them. They lead a false self, and they're constantly pleasing everybody, even before the person is aware they want
Mhm.
what what uh, whatever it is the person's giving them. The problem is that they are so intent on doing that these people lose track of what they wanted from their own lives. Um, they don't lead a life. They're constantly taking care of others.
Yeah.
Um, and this really comes home to roost for most women when the last kid leaves for college and they devoted their lives toward taking care of the family, and now the family is, flown the coop,
Mhm.
and they're saying, well, what about me? When is it my turn? And everybody else is uh, kind of resistant to that because they kind of enjoy it, their every need being constantly met by their mom. The third group are those who just give up on
Ah,
ever being able to be good enough. The slackers of the world. I mean, how many people do you know who are brilliant people, likable people, have a college degree from a competitive university, and they live in their parents' basement?
right.
Because if they can imagine the possibility of falling short or possibility of disappointing somebody and gaining their disapproval, they're not going to start the task.
Mhm.
No, thank you. I do not want any part of that. And so these are people who have never in their lives applied for a job. They have never asked a person out on a date because
Yeah.
just the possibility of being told no is too frightening,
Yeah, it
too
doesn't have to have
devastating.
occurred. It could potentially occur. It
That's right.
grinds people. Yeah.
These events are so incredibly catastrophically painful. They don't even want to give them a chance of happening.
So how is that
So
different than anxiety?
anxiety, by definition, is a baseless, apprehensive fear.
Okay.
Okay, that's, in other words, for no reason, I feel as if something awful is just about to happen. And it's usually constant. People who are anxious are constantly anxious, and they don't even know what about. They'll go around looking for something to be threatening.
Okay.
These are the people who have phobias, for instance.
Mhm.
They uh, can't go to high buildings or into tunnels on the highway or something like that. Um, but again, it's a baseless apprehensive fear. If you talk to somebody with rejection sensitivity, they can tell you in great detail about the times this has actually happened. They know how bad it is.
Mhm.
And so God has a um, weird sense of humor as he creates people who are exquisitely sensitive to criticism and then gives them the ADHD nervous system in which that's all they hear.
Right.
Michael Jello's seminal paper that found that by the time a child gets to be 10 years of age, which is about third, fourth grade, they have heard 20,000 additional negative or corrective messages in school alone.
Mhm.
20,000. So people with ADHD are constantly getting bombarded with criticism that people don't like who they are and how they behave, and
Right.
they're constantly being told to change who they are. So that people with ADHD are exquisitely sensitive and then get a constant diet of being told they're wrong. Their very nature is
Yeah.
wrong and they better change it in a hurry. So for many people with ADHD, they lead traumatic lives that, again, nobody sees but them,
Yeah. The silent suffering.
right? The silent
Yeah.
suffering. So the teacher thinks they've been offering the kid good advice and good direction about what they need in order to succeed. But really, what they've been doing is invalidating their very nature.
Hmm.
So this is something that is a huge, huge factor in most people's lives that they keep hidden.
Mm.
They don't want anybody to know that because they might, people will use it against them to manipulate them.
Gaslight them. Yeah.
Yeah. They also want to avoid pain. Those
Right.
these things are dysphoric. They are unbearably painful.
Unbearable. And that's a big word there, the unbearable, the
Yeah,
dysphoria.
yeah.
So is our
Go ahead.
sorry, is RSD like, so ADHD is a neurological difference wiring of the brain. That's what I say. Is RSD a neurological uh difference of the brain, or is it more the fact that is it amplified by the ADHD brain's sensitivity to emotions? The way I understand is that the ADHD brain senses emotions intensely, immediately, and quickly.
Right. The also what the ADHD brain is that it doesn't have any filters.
Right.
You experience everything in its most raw and intense
Yeah.
form. Your organization is called the Impulsive Thinker. And again, people with ADHD are brilliant out of the box problem solvers, but they can't screen their own thoughts or
Right.
their own emotions.
Yeah.
Now they can't inhibit them, so they come out raw. Uh, they say and do things impulsively. In other words, without thinking, without that filter
Hmm.
to say, is this the time and place and person to say this? No, most people with ADHD, untreated ADHD, excuse me, but most people with untreated ADHD find out what they're feeling and thinking because it's out there. They find out the same way everybody else does. It's out there and they immediately go, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. I want it back,
Yeah.
but it's too late.
Yeah. The difference of brain inhibition, as I call it.
Yeah. In fact, there's a whole theory, and I think it's a very good one. It's somewhat limited, but of ADHD as a relative lack of inhibition.
Hmm.
Uh, and lack of inhibition of movement. That's what the hyperactivity is. Lack of inhibition of distractions and other things other than what you
Yeah.
want to work on, and a lack of inhibition of expression, either physically or emotionally,
Yeah.
of what you're thinking and feeling.
Yeah. And for me, I don't
Uh,
like personally, I don't like the term lack because it sounds like it's a shortfall. That's why I started using the term. It's a
yeah,
difference. It's a difference of
yeah,
inhibition, impulsivity,
yeah.
physical
I
movement.
always
Yeah.
use the word relative lack.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. Um,
It's not as much as you needed at the moment.
yeah.
How's that?
Yeah. 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 But I think that's a really good point too. Like you mentioned earlier, is that the ADHD person lives an intense and passionate lives, and we're also criticized that we're too passionate or too lively and too sensitive. Stop being so sensitive. I remember
Yeah,
that being. And
and
why do you
that's
care so much
also
about
vulnerable.
that?
The thing is, it really does hurt them that way, and it
Right.
hurts them more than a neurotypical person. And neurotypical people just don't get that.
Yeah.
ADHD person lives in a different world
Yeah.
with different rules, and things really are that intense.
So as an
Uh,
entrepreneur, sorry, finish off your thought.
but no, I'm
So
finished.
that was my
Go
impulsive and inhibition challenge there.
ahead.
So now go ahead, finish your thought.
uh, it's just that people who are neurotypical believe that people with ADHD are exactly the same way they are. That
Yeah.
they're neurotypical, that they work on the basis of you do what's important and what you'll get rewarded for, or you don't do the things you might get punished for. Same, just reverse. Without really noticing, oh, pardon me,
Bless you.
without really noticing that people with ADHD are fundamentally different. And this is what we talked about in the last session.
Hmm.
That their nervous systems don't work on importance or rewards at all. That people with ADHD are fundamentally different. Their nervous systems work on the acronym we used was NICUP,
Yes.
NICUP, novelty, interest, challenge, urgency, and passion. Those are the things that get somebody with ADHD engaged with the project, keep them engaged, get them access to their abilities so they can get stuff done. importance for people with ADHD is nothing but a nag.
Right.
So that's the cognitive component of ADHD. What we're here to talk about today is the emotional component of ADHD, which up until just very recently was intentionally totally ignored.
Yeah.
It still is totally ignored in the United States. All of the new work is being done in the European Union. And back in 2019, they issued an update of their adult criteria, and they added a fourth core criteria.
Nice.
In the United States, we have distractibility, impulsivity, hyperarousal. In Europe, they added something called emotional dysregulation. I'm not fond of the word dysregulation. Basically,
Yeah.
it's a difficulty with controlling your emotions
Hmm.
so that you express them when you want to, and your emotions don't overwhelm you out of the blue.
Yeah.
And so, at least everywhere else in the world, except the United States, we now recognize that emotional dysregulation is probably the single most impairing part of ADHD. But in the United States, it's ignored.
Yeah.
It's up by like 2 people who
Yeah.
do
Canada
know.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
uh, it's a huge piece. Fred Reimer, who I mentioned earlier, who was sort of the godfather of ADHD, just 2 years ago wrote a paper saying that if he had it all to do over again, if he were back in the 60s trying to figure out what ADHD was, it would be just 2 things. It would be distractibility and an inability to control the expression of your emotions
Right.
or the intensity of your emotions. He says you can explain everything in ADHD and every impairment of ADHD with those 2 concepts.
Yeah. Exactly. So a lot of our listeners are highly passionate and intense entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
So now that we're aware of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or RSD, what can we do to manage the RSD, or being aware? Like, what would you recommend?
Well, that's the question earlier that I didn't get around to answering, and that is, do I think it's neurological?
Right.
And the answer is yes, I do, because right now uh, the biggest thing we can do is offer medications. There are 2, actually 3 medications that can almost make rejection sensitivity go away. It's when they work, they're truly life-saving. They're called the alpha-2 agonists. The whole name is alpha-2 specific adrenergic receptor agonists,
Hmm.
which is why we shorten it to alpha agonists. And they're old blood pressure medications. They first came on the market back in the 60s. But back in the 90s, we recognized that they were very good medications for ADHD. And so they've been FDA approved for the treatment of the intensity part, the hyperarousal, the impulsivity, the rejection sensitivity, the sleep disturbances of ADHD and stuff like that. The 2 drugs are guanfacine,
Hmm.
Guanfacine, and clonidine, Clonidine. And they're originally blood pressure medications, which means that their side effects are going to be very low. They're unabusable. And usually they are not used as standalone medications. They are used in conjunction with a stimulant. The stimulants are marvelous at one thing, and that is once you're engaged, they keep you from being distracted.
Right. Yeah.
They do that marvelously, but they don't touch impulsivity that much. They don't touch the emotional component. They don't touch hyperactivity unless they're in overdose. And so for that, we've been adding in the alpha agonists. And again, it was in the process of doing that with my patients that I discovered that when I did this for a significant number of people, more than half, it's about 60%, the rejection sensitivity just seemed to dissolve, it went
Hmm.
away. And people say, this has changed my life.
Yeah.
It takes a while to fine tune the dose. It takes about 2 weeks to fine tune the dose, because every time you change the dose, it takes about 5 days to see the benefits from it.
So same
So
idea as titrating for the stimulants or any other type of medication,
exactly,
which is different for every
but
person and brain.
yeah, that's right. But for most people, about 80% of the people who are going to respond, the dose ends up at being about 3 tablets, 3 milligrams of guanfacine, 3/10 of a milligram of clonidine. And at that dose, the rejection sensitivity goes away and they have no side effects.
Hmm.
So it's really, really good. And they sleep great.
Oh,
It's
that'd be
not,
nice.
it's not a drug sleep. It basically gets rid of the hyperarousal so that they sleep normally.
Ah, that's interesting.
It's a twofer.
Hmm.
Uh, so if you the response rate, the robust response rate, either one of these is fairly small. It's about 30%. It's kind of disappointing, but it's a different 30% to each medication. So if the first one doesn't knock it out of the park, you stop it and you try the other one, and there's a 30% chance of a life-changing level of response to that one. So that if you end up having to try both medications, the life-changing response rate is about 60%, which is about the same as any other psychiatric medication.
Wow.
Um, so it's pretty good. So what do you do for the other 40%? Well, ever since they identified atypical depression, um, the treatment of choice for atypical depression has been the monoamine oxidase inhibitor drugs, which were our very first antidepressant and anti-anxiety medications back in the 60s.
Hmm.
But they're no longer used anymore because they have a lot of drug-to-drug interactions and what are now recognized to be some minor dietary restrictions. But those medications can make rejection sensitivity dysphoria almost go away entirely.
Wow.
But again, you have to find somebody as old as I am who was trained on MAOIs. You know, it's one of these things where if you look on the back of old sinus and hay fever medications, it'll say, don't take this if you're also taking a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So um, ultimately, we're able to uh, offer almost complete symptom relief with one or the other of these two classes of medication.
Wow. Well, there's lots to unpack there. And yeah, rejection sensitivity. You just blew me away with that other part where the perceived rejection is external, but also internal. Like we can cause
Yeah.
our own rejection, RSD.
Yeah.
And then
And
since
what person with ADHD doesn't have this just incredibly nasty self-talk going on in
I
their
haven't found
heads?
one yet.
Yeah. And again, if somebody else said that to them, they would, punch them out.
Yeah.
But saying it to themselves is normalized.
Well, that's the thing. I
Oh,
always tell people, is, you can tell me whatever you want. I do a lot worse to
yeah.
myself.
Yeah, you guys are pikers.
Yeah.
Well, we're pros. You're amateurs.
Yeah. And I like, the fact that it is true. The ADHD brain, we definitely live in intense and passionate lives that it's just not understood. And, you're accused of being extra sensitive and, stop overreacting. But like you
No,
said before, it means something to us. It hurts us physically as well. And just like dysphoria is a Greek for unbearable. And just hearing you explain that it's unbearable, I guarantee you a lot of people are going, yep, get it, got it.
yeah.
So this is fantastic. So thanks again
Can I
for,
add
yeah,
one last thing
you
in
sure
there?
can.
Because with the use of the stimulants, if the dose goes too high, you can get what's called the zombie syndrome,
Yeah.
where people are overly inhibited to where they lose facial expression, they lose initiative, and the medication works against itself. So more is not better. But the alpha agonists, while they remove the rejection sensitivity, do not remove all the other emotions.
Right.
You're still the same person. Remember that the goal of medications in ADHD is not to change people.
Right.
It's to allow them to get the ADHD out of their way so that they can be the best version of themselves.
Thank you.
And that's something that has to be emphasized over and over again. It's one of the
Yeah,
biggest resistances people have to trying medication is, I don't want to be different. And that's important for neurotypical people to know is people with ADHD really, it's not that they don't want to be ADHD, it's just they don't want to be mistreated by neurotypical people.
exactly.
Um, or have their personalities drugged away. So both with the stimulants and the alpha agonists, if they're fine-tuned, you should not feel like you're on a medication. You should just be in touch with the very best version of yourself.
And that's one of the reasons I'm highly respected. I got a lot of respect for you is you always know how to communicate that ADHD is not a problem.
Yeah.
It's almost a societal problem. It's not ours. It's just a difference, and that there's nothing wrong with our brain. It's just different. And you're able to communicate that effectively and provide us a vocabulary to to move things forward and to be proud of ourselves. So I really
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. And that's another example of knowing the right question to ask. The people who are listening to this, go ahead. I'll ask the question and take a few moments to reflect on it and how it pertains to you as an individual. Look back over your entire life. If you've been able to get engaged and stay engaged with literally any task of your life, have you ever found anything you couldn't do?
Right. And I think for that, we'll leave that question to the listeners. I would
You
like
know,
you guys to email me what your answers are. Where can they find you, Dr. Dodson?
well, we're trying to write a book right now, and it's simply entitled Treating ADHD. We hope to have it out into the summer, early fall, and it'll be on Amazon. Um, right now, the problem is that we've got too much material.
Lots to say about
We're
it, eh?
having to cut it back and make it pithy. Um, so that will be out. There's also a website that we're in the process of populating right now, and it's called Dodson treatingadhd.com. So 4 or 5 months from now, it's going to be a really good website. Right now, it's a little bare bones. So if you want to see the stuff that I've written and the 20 webinars that I've done for Attitude Magazine,
Highly recommend
that's
those.
where the vast majority of my work is.
Yeah.
And that's online at Attitude, ADDITUDE, mag.com. Tells you how far back Attitude goes. It was originally a magazine that predated the internet. And everything they have ever published is there and available for free.
And it's a great resource for anyone out there. It
Tremendous
helped me a
resource.
lot tremendously during my journey.
Yeah. And the other thing is that periodically, about every 4 or 5 years, they'll get their board of advisors to go through and they review every single article to
Mhm.
make sure it's still up to date, it's still accurate, it matches what our new knowledge is, so
Yeah.
they keep it up to date and things like that. And I don't know of another website that does a complete house cleaning every 5 years.
Yeah.
So
That's huge. That's good to know. I didn't realize that.
yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, I did all the medication ones. It
Well, I
took me a
appreciate
week
you
to
doing
read
that.
those,
Yeah.
bring them up to date. Um,
So awesome.
everything there is accurate and up to date and authoritative, and most of all, free.
Yes. And thanks again, Dr. Dodson, for your time here, sharing your knowledge about RSD. Know that the listeners are very appreciative of this and probably will stop by the side of the road or somewhere and say, hey, this makes a lot of sense to me. So to you, Dr. Dodson, thank you very much. And to you, the
Glad to be
listeners.
here.
Yeah. And to you, the listeners, thanks again for learning with me. Talk to you soon.